For decades, Paul McCartney was the smiling Beatle, the peace-loving songwriter who could charm anyone in the room.
The world saw him as gentle, diplomatic, always above the drama.
But behind that warm grin, there are names he never forgot. Names that crossed him. Names that copied him.
And now, at 82, Paul McCartney is done pretending. He's finally revealing the 6 bands that mocked him, mimicked him, and tried to overshadow everything the Beatles built. One band even had the nerve to call themselves bigger than the Beatles. And at the very top of Paul's silent hate list is the Rolling Stones. For years, people believed the rivalry between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones was friendly.
But Paul didn't see it that way.
He believed the Stones followed his band like a shadow. In the late 60s, when Paul was spending sleepless nights shaping the revolutionary sound of Revolver, backwards guitar solos, layered harmonies, unheard textures.
They were always copying us. Always following.
And when Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band changed the world, the Stones responded with their Satanic Majesty's request, complete with psychedelic costumes, the same cosmic themes, and even a cover design that looked almost identical.
Paul supposedly slammed a copy of the record down on a table in Abbey Road, furious. They even stole the bloody cover.
And decades later, that wound still hadn't healed. In 2021, Paul finally said it out loud to The New Yorker, "The Rolling Stones are a blues cover band."
Our net was cast a bit wider.
Mick Jagger laughed it off on stage, joking, "Paul's adorable, but we're still playing stadiums." But at that moment, the world saw something it had never seen before, Paul McCartney without the smile. But behind all the jokes and interviews, the bitterness never really faded. Engineers who have worked with Paul say he'll talk freely about Elvis, Dylan, and even Lennon's wildest days. But if someone brings up Jagger or Richards, Paul just goes quiet.
No jokes. No smiles. Just silence.
And that silence tells its own story. Next on Paul McCartney's blacklist, the Sex Pistols, the band that didn't just disrespect his music, they insulted him to his face.
This one wasn't about creative rivalry.
It was a direct attack. In early 1977, at London's Air Studios, Paul was there recording with Wings when he crossed paths with the Pistols in the hallway.
Paul, being Paul, offered a polite hello. Sid Vicious looked him in the eye and said, "You're just another establishment sellout." Paul froze.
Even Lennon had argued with him, challenged him, pushed him, but no one had ever spit in his face like that. From that moment, punk wasn't rebellion to Paul, it was noise pretending to be revolution. He once described the Pistols' sound as chaos dressed up as art.
But the Pistols didn't back down.
Johnny Rotten mocked Paul publicly, calling him a fossil in a velvet suit, saying Beatles music was something your grandmother would play at tea time.
To them, Paul was the past.
But to Paul, they were the proof that respect in music had died. What made the insult cut even deeper was that the media loved it. Headlines praised the Pistols for punking a Beatle, fans laughed, and critics called it a symbolic changing of the guard. Paul tried to play it cool later, saying, "It wasn't my thing, but maybe it cleared the air." But everyone who knew him understood there was a scar there.
Paul could handle criticism.
He could handle being challenged.
But being mocked in his own studio, face to face, with cameras watching?
That one stayed with him.
And then came Oasis. The wannabe Beatles that pushed Paul's patience further than anyone else. Third on Paul McCartney's "You've Got to Be Kidding Me" list.
The Gallagher brothers didn't just admire the Beatles, they tried to be the Beatles. In the 1990s, at the peak of Britpop, Noel and Liam Gallagher claimed they were the new Beatles.
They copied the hair, the album art,
the swagger.
Noel even admitted, if it weren't for the Beatles, there'd be no Oasis.
Sounds respectful, but to Paul, it felt like someone trying on his clothes, looking in the mirror, and calling themselves original, behind closed doors. Paul said Oasis sounded loud, inflated, and desperate to be remembered. The breaking point came in 1996 when Noel told MTV, "We are bigger than the Beatles." Paul laughed, shook his head, and told a friend, they copied the chords, not the soul. From that moment forward, Paul didn't hate their fame.
He hated their entitlement.
Later, on radio, he joked, "They remind me of us, except we could actually play." Noel eventually tried to make peace and called Paul a hero, but the damage was already sealed.
Paul never collaborated with them, never joined their tributes. And he summed up his feelings with a single line: "You can't inherit greatness. You have to bleed for it." Next, we get to the Monkees.
The one band Paul mocked most openly. To him, they weren't musicians at all.
They were actors hired by a TV studio to cash in on Beatlemania. And it drove him insane.
When "I'm a Believer" came on the radio, Paul would switch it off and say, "They're singing our style without earning it." But the breaking point came in 1967.
Just months after Sgt. Pepper's changed music forever, the Monkees suddenly went psychedelic. Bright costumes, surreal visuals, flower power, everything. To Paul, it wasn't influence, it was theft.
That was the moment McCartney stopped seeing the Monkees as harmless copycats and started seeing them as outright frauds.
And things got uncomfortable quickly.
At a party in Los Angeles, Monkees frontman Mickey Dolenz tried to start a friendly conversation. Paul listened for a few seconds, offered a polite, restrained smile, then turned and walked away mid-sentence.
Dolenz later said, "I don't think he ever saw us as musicians."
And he was right. Even decades later, the attitude never changed. When someone asked Paul in 2011 what he thought of the Monkees, he gave that famous gentle smirk and said, "Catchy tunes, but certainly no Beatles." The smile said peace, but the tone said never compare us again. Then came the Bee Gees. The night Paul realized music had moved on without him. Fifth on Paul's secret list, and arguably the one that stung the deepest.
Because Paul didn't just dislike the Bee Gees.
He hated what they symbolized. Their silky falsettos had taken over the territory where the Beatles once ruled alone. And Paul felt it in his bones. He told Wings guitarist Lawrence Ubeyer, "It's the same 3 chords as everyone else, just faster."
It sounded like a joke. But behind it was something Paul didn't often show: jealousy.
The Bee Gees had broken sales records that once belonged to him. And in 1979, when both acts were recording in Miami, Paul reportedly rearranged his studio schedule so he wouldn't bump into them.
An engineer who was there said, "You could feel the tension."
The Bee Gees were celebrating another hit, and Paul just stared at the floor. For someone who'd once defined the sound of youth, watching the world dance to someone else's music wasn't just frustrating.
It was painful. The Bee Gees never insulted Paul. Never mocked him.
Never even spoke badly of the Beatles.
They didn't have to. Paul's silence said everything. It wasn't rivalry.
It was the grief of watching your own era slip into the rearview mirror. Last on McCartney's hate list, and maybe the most complicated of all, were the Beach Boys.
This wasn't rivalry in the loud, public way. This was envy. The quiet kind that creeps in when someone else touches perfection first.
In 1966, when Pet Sounds was released, Paul was stunned. He called God Only Knows one of the most beautiful songs ever written.
But that admiration didn't stay pure for long.
It turned into competition. It turned into pressure.
Paul told George Martin, "We've got to top this."
The result became Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
And yes, it worked. It changed the world.
But deep down, Paul knew where that fire came from. It came from chasing Brian Wilson. Then Brian began crafting Smile, an album so ambitious it scared people. The real fracture came later that year, at a dinner in Los Angeles. Paul made an offhand remark that the Beach Boys' new tracks sounded simplistic.
Brian Wilson went silent for days. After that night, fans noticed he stopped mentioning Paul at all. And even decades later, Paul never gave the Beach Boys full, unqualified credit. He would praise God Only Knows, then follow it with, for American pop of that time. Always a soft limitation. Always a ceiling. Maybe Paul didn't hate the Beach Boys, maybe he hated the part of himself that needed them to get better. So we ask you, were Paul's grudges justified, or was he simply exhausted from a lifetime of being imitated, mirrored, and challenged at every corner of his legacy? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more untold stories from music's biggest legends.